Hello, this is Mouse Gunner, and welcome to Blood Bowl 2. I'll be continuing a series of tutorials, this time covering how to set up your team in Blood Bowl. Now, we've just had the coin toss, and I won the coin toss, which allowed me to determine who would be receiving the ball. I chose to receive the ball, which means I will be starting on offense, and my opponent will be starting on defense. So now that the coin toss is over, we are now in the setup phase of the game. Now, whether you're starting on offense or defense will determine who sets up first. Defense will always be setting up first, and then the offensive team will be setting up second. So because I am starting on the offense, I get to set up second. So let's go ahead and watch as the AI does their setup. Okay. It is now my turn to do the setup, and unfortunately, I do have a time limit to do so. It is not possible for me to turn off the time limit, so I'll be pausing often so that I can discuss with you some of the rules and strategy of setting up. Now, your basic rules for setting up are how many players you can have on the field is limited to 11 maximum. You may have a team that is larger than that, but you can have no more than 11 players on the field at any particular time. It may be possible that you have no choice but to have less than 11 players on the field. This is perfectly fine as long as you follow some of the other guidelines involved. It is advisable, though, to always set up with your maximum 11 players so that you're not numerically at a disadvantage. That being said, the other two basic rules are guidelines on how you have to set up. So the first basic rule of setup is that you must have a minimum of 3 players in the starting line, which is the line of squares that go from this dash line here to the next dash line up against the halfway marker. So this row of lines right here is the starting lineup. As I said, you must have a minimum of 3 players in that zone. Now, these dash lines here, both on the left and right, will show you where the 2 wings are. So you have a left wing over here and a right wing. You are limited to only having a maximum of 2 players in each wing. Every other player will then be allowed to set up anywhere within this middle portion. So right now, I have a legal setup where I only have 2 players in each wing, which is the maximum, and I have 3 players in the starting lineup. Okay, so that's pretty much all the basic rules. So a lot of the rest of setting up is all strategy. And with the setup that I have right now, we're utilizing tackle zones. Now, a lot of the elements of what I'll be talking about in this video, I explain in more detail in other tutorial videos. But to explain simply, tackle zones are all adjacent spaces next to a unit. And both friendly characters and enemy characters have tackle zones that need to be considered. So for my setup, what I've done is I've spaced out my players so that there is a space on every space in this area is covered by a tackle zone, because my character here has a tackle zone that encompasses all of these spaces that I'm highlighting right now, as does the character next to him. So you can see with the spacing that I've done with this setup, I have every space in these several rows of spaces covered by a tackle zone. What this allows me to do is it allows me to contend with a lot of different situations. First off, for an opposing player to get through these tackle zones, they either must make a dodge roll, and every dodge roll that they make has a possibility that they will fall. If a player falls on the turn of the controlling player, so the player whose turn it is, this will result in a turnover, which will end that player's turn at that point, which is a very bad result. So for teams that rely a lot on agility and dodging through lines, this presents quite a challenge to them, because there's a lot of spaces that they have to dodge through to get through my lines. And even if they end up in the middle of my lines, I can quickly maybe throw a block or a blitz at them, knock them down, and then thus neutralizing them. So I have players in the backfield to deal with anyone that breaks through my front line. The other element of the tackle zones is that the other way that they can get through them is by knocking down the player that is putting them up to eliminate them. As long as a player is on the ground and down, he no longer exhibits tackle zones, so you can get through that area. Well, if this player, for instance, was knocked down, the next line would present another row of tackle zones that opposing team would have to get through. This is why this is a very good setup to deal with different situations, regardless of team, regardless of what that strategy of the team is, whether it to be a more beat-em-up style, more physical style, or a more offensively minded, agile style, dodging through your lines and maybe passing the ball through the air. This can deal with either of those strategies, a more conservative setup like this. But there may be, depending on what team you're playing, call for a more aggressive strategy where you set up players very close to the line so you can take advantage of a lot of blocks, because those tackle zones determine how many blocks you can do in a given turn. The only way you can throw a block is by starting the turn with an opposing player in a tackle zone. You cannot move and throw a block in the same turn. The only way you can do that is by doing a blitz move, which allows you to combine those two elements, moving and blocking, but you can only do that once per turn with one player. So there is very much a limit to how many blocks you can throw in a turn, and your initial setup may dictate that. So let's go ahead and look at our setup and discuss how it affects, how many blocks the opposing team can have on us. So right now, because the opposing team and them being the defense, we can see exactly how they've done their setup. They essentially have every single one of my players that is in the front row here in a tackle zone. So every single one of these players can be blocked next turn. So to minimize that, I can do an alternative setup. So let's go ahead and do that. And I've already saved this to save a little bit of time. So with this setup here, we see that we still have the same legal elements. We have 3 players in the front. We have 2 players in, maximum in the wings. But we still utilize the same kind of idea of maximizing tackle zone coverage. But by having our players a little further back, we have minimized how many players are in direct contact with the enemy. So in this instance, only the 3 players that are in the starting line, this front row of squares, are in direct contact with the enemy, and only these 3 players can be blocked. So outside of that, the team only has 1 blitz that they can utilize to push through my lines. Now, the disadvantage of this lineup is I have weaknesses. If this player were to be knocked down, there is no longer any coverage of this wing off to the side, close to the sidelines. So the opposing player could then rush a player through this part and then maybe in a future turn throw him the ball, thus circumventing my defense. So this is a definite weakness of this lineup. A definite weakness of my previous setup is the fact that I have more players in direct contact, which allows the opposing team to push more easily through my starting line. And I still have the same disadvantage then. If they were to knock down this player, they could then throw a blitz on this player, knocking him down and thus opening up this side of the field. So both setups have their disadvantages, but both try and do the same kind of idea, is kind of delaying the opponent, making them contend with the most tackle zones possible. Now, to set up your players, essentially all you're going to need to do is click on a player and then click where you want him to go. So if I want to move him up here to assist this player in a block, all I have to do is click that spot and then click again, and I will move to that spot. If then to move him back, I just click and click again, and you can move him. At any time, if you click a spot that you don't really want to move to, all you have to do is right-click, and that move will be canceled. If you accidentally select on the wrong character, which I currently have this character selected, another right mouse button will deselect him. So that's pretty much the basics of doing setup and some of the elements of strategy. All that we have left is to discuss which players to set up where. Now, this can be a very complicated element of setting up, as every team will be a little bit different. But usually speaking, your very strong characters, like this ogre here, who has a strength of 5, are advisable to put up in the starting line And if you don't have many of those players that are very strong, another advisable type of player to put in the starting lineup is a player that is expendable. For instance, this lineman is one of the cheapest units that the human team has, and he doesn't have really any set disadvantages, but he also doesn't have any set weaknesses. This means that if he were to be a casualty, his low expense isn't really going to, cripple your team too much for the future, so he's not an overly valuable player. So that's another element of the strategy is you have to keep in mind that the players in the starting lineup are going to be the ones that are going to have the most physical confrontations. They're going to have the most blocks thrown on them, and they are potentially going to be the ones that get knocked down a lot. So the potential for them to be wounded is quite high. So you want to keep that in mind, and that's why I recommend putting maybe less valuable players in there. But you don't want to have players that are a liability. For instance, if you're playing an orc team, Goblins are probably not the best in your starting lineup because they have a strength weakness, and a single opponent can overcome them with a block without needing any assists. They get that extra die, that extra block die to throw, and that is definitely a disadvantage you don't want. Players that are offensive minded, like my thrower, he doesn't have any particular advantages over my linemen. As far as stats-wise, but as far as his skills go, his ability to do things offensively, passing the ball, picking the ball up, mean that he's an advisable player to put in the rear. And maybe if you're on defense, not even to field. If you have enough players so that you don't need to field your thrower, maybe don't when it's time for defense. Players such as catchers are another player that you don't want to have in direct contact with your the opposing players. You want to use them in an offensive role. Whether you have them in the front and the back depends on a number of circumstances, but they're another player that maybe isn't advisable to put on the field when you're on defense. So which players you play, whether you're on offense or defense, will depend on that situation. And where you put them in your lineup will also depend on what their skill set is and what their strengths and weaknesses are. So for instance, a blitzer here, as far as stats-wise goes, he has more or less a lot of the same stats as a lineman, outside of the fact that he has more movement ability, as well as he has the block skill, which is quite an advantage. So that advantage might be good for, putting him up front, but also you can take advantage of his movement speed to put him in the rear as well, because that greater movement speed means he can cover more ground and make up for the fact that he's a little further back. So in this instance, I have a blitzer here and I have a blitzer here. And obviously you could vary that up. Maybe you would replace him with this lineman who's a little bit more expendable. And you can utilize his greater movement speed to your advantage. In any case, I'm starting to run out of time, but I think I've explained pretty well a lot of the basics when it comes to both rules and strategy of setting up. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. This is Mouse Gunner signing out.